My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to what I am sure will be another riveting presentation in this March of the Living Australia's 14th online event this year. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Whilst anti-Semitism is often referred to as the oldest form of bigotry, hatred, and discrimination, there have been periods of relative quiet, followed by dramatic increases once again. We unfortunately are currently living through a period of deeply disturbing and worrying resurgence in blatant, overt, and vulgar acts of anti-Semitism in all its forms. Sadly, but not unexpectedly, this also comes at a time when bigotry, hatred, and discrimination prevail against other minorities and ethnic groups as well. In the shadows, however, of all this darkness, there thankfully are rays of hope with acts and movements of people who believe in the premise of all people being one, that there is no place for hatred, and that we need to respect each other in order to respect ourselves. One such person is our honorable guest speaker this evening, Fiyaz Mughal, a Muslim who actively educates and fosters tolerance, respect, trust, sister and brotherhood amongst diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious groups and people. Fiyaz has dedicated a large part of his life to interfaith dialogue and understanding and many other noble causes. He will share with us a panoramic snapshot of the effects and causes of radical fundamentalist Islam in the UK, and will share with us some of the incredible stories that he has been part of in his endeavors as a founder of Muslims Against Antisemitism, Faith Matters, and other areas of his community work, for which he has been honored with the title OBE. So now, without further ado, it's over to Fiyaz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I hope clearly I'm coming across clearly. And I just also wanted just to start off by giving obviously a little bit of an overview that has been impacting upon us all across the country, in fact, not just across the country, across the globe. The fact is, we know that if there's a conflict in the Middle East, that there are then spikes in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidences that actually affect Jewish communities globally. We know that. There's lots of data on that around hate crimes and the rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes that takes place when there is conflict in the Middle East. That took place in 2014. It took place in Gaza 2002, 2003, and it took place just very recently, a few months ago. So the issue of anti-Semitic hate crimes is one measure and one indicator, a statistical measure and a community impact measure of the rise in hatred whenever there's a conflict in the Middle East. And there's no way of getting around that. That sadly a small but vocal section of my co-religionists are involved in that activity, in the promotion of anti-Semitic rhetoric and narratives. Clearly, it's not the majority of Muslims, but a small and vocal minority that's quite active and quite driven in its political ideology, just fixated on the Palestinian issue. And we know that also some in the UK, in the United Kingdom context, that anti-Semitism took root many decades ago within some sections of Muslim communities. And that goes back pretty much to the mid-1980s, historically here in the UK, and partly fueled by the rise of Islamism or political Islam. And this will clearly affect your country, Australia, because the fact is political Islam and Islamism has been something that has exported not only people who believe in the ideology, but a sense of, in a way, a sense of purpose for these individuals as a form of dominating Muslim communities, as a form of not just political Islam, but a way of subverting the diversity and pluralism of thought within Muslim communities. So what political Islam and Islamism has brought with it is a form of domination within Muslim communities, that Islam is just to be practiced in one way, it is to be thought of, and people need to conduct a lot of groupthink. And actually the reality is that is not the case, because Muslim communities, like many others, are very diverse and very pluralistic in their opinions and in their backgrounds. So Islamism, in the context of what I'm talking about today, is a politicized version of the faith of Islam, where the state and its structures and Sharia law merge, and where faith and politics meld into one. That's the context, that's the lens by which I'm looking at the talk today. And within this melting pot, those who want to see the destruction or the removal of the state of Israel and self-determination by Jews have become the most vocal and influential in parts of my co-religions. You know, this was super fueled. Some of this Islamist thinking was super fueled by the Iranian Revolution. We have to go back. This is not just a recent phenomenon. The Iranian Revolution super fueled it. The Islamist takeover of Pakistan by General Zia-ul-Haq in the 1970s and 80s super fueled it. And the conflict in Afghanistan against the Russians super fueled it. So there have been three trigger points in the 1980s predominantly, which have provided an engine for Islamist ideology to spread. And we are dealing still with the offshoots, the evolution, the connotations of that Islamist ideology, which began to take root in countries and in systemic structures of majority Muslim countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran in the 1980s. That is the root of this problem. And it is also the root of part of the anti-Semitic rhetoric we are seeing 4 decades on. We are dealing with that 4 decades on. And sadly, we will deal with it for longer, given you can see the impacts that it has had and the reverberations that it has had. And let's be in no doubt that when the Iranian Revolution took place, the relations between Israel and Iran deteriorated rapidly, from effectively cordial and warm relations between the Shah of Iran and Israel to effective enmity and hostility from the Iranian side. So you can clearly see the ideology which was already seeded from the initial takeover by the religious theocrats in Iran. So we knew the direction of travel. What we are seeing in terms of the rhetoric is an evolution, a reimagination of those lines drawn in the 1980s. And so we shouldn't underestimate how these 3 geopolitical events have influenced parts of British Muslim communities from the 1980s. Now, I want to go back slightly, and I said 3 things: Iranian Revolution, Islamist takeover of Pakistan by General Zia-ul-Haq, and I talked about the conflict in Afghanistan. But the second one, the takeover effectively militarily of Pakistan by General Zia-ul-Haq, has an impact in the UK context. It doesn't really have a significant impact for Australia, but in the UK context it does, because we have a large population, a British Muslim population of Pakistani heritage here in the United Kingdom. So the diaspora link is important. And the fact is, General Zia-ul-Haq's military domination and dictatorship of Pakistan introduced a whole range of Sharia practices within the country, and the merging and the fusing of the religious with the state structures within a militaristic state. And you can see within such a structure the opportunity for not just autocratic sub-leaders to take root, but you can see how religion can be suddenly become the driving force in a form of conservative politics that also gives space to religious extremism. There is a blurring line between that conservatism and religious extremism which took place in Pakistan during that period of time. And so the diaspora link is important to mention. Obviously, I think there's large Lebanese populations in Australia and some Arab populations, but your dynamic is distinctly different from our dynamic here in the United Kingdom. But what I'm trying to show you is that the international linkages carry on, the diaspora linkages carry on, and things have changed clearly, but over a period of time, those influences took root. But then if we drill down further in terms of Islamist groups, the Islamist group, which is really in a way supercharged that takeover in a way of countries like, I would say Pakistan, a takeover of countries like Afghanistan, and so much clearly in the Iranian context because of the Shia-Sunni split. But the Muslim Brotherhood has been one of the groups and its offshoots in mainly Arab majority countries that has been actively trying to co-opt the Israel-Palestine conflict into their narratives. Okay, so the first thing I have to say is the Muslim Brotherhood has been very active for decades in Arab majority countries like Egypt, partly in Libya, a little bit in Algeria. There has been active involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood and its groups in co-opting the Israel-Palestine conflict into their narrative to try to draw in people, to try to draw in and campaign and draw in a wider set of individuals to be part of their groups. Socially ultra-conservative and with a view of Islam being under threat, that is the view by which the Muslim Brotherhood had effectively looked at the world as a view of suspicion to the outside world, but also with a view of anti-Israel, and I would say an anti-Israel stance, but also one with strong anti-Semitic undertones and overtones within the group. And so by co-opting the Arab-Israeli conflict, both political or military, they have effectively sent out a message that they didn't want to see the existence of the state of Israel. That was what they said, and we know that to be clearly anti-Semitic. There is no political discourse to say that Israel should not exist without us calling it what it is basically genocidal anti-Semitism. Okay, so that's been a driving force within the Muslim Brotherhood's view, as well as within Iran's Shia theological rhetoric. I don't really want to, in a way, give the impression that all the Shia community think that way. Clearly, the Shia community are very large, very diverse in its cultural background, but certainly the theocracy in Iran certainly believes part of this view, not part, but certainly believes in a wholehearted attempt to try to annihilate the state of Israel. So there's a connection, even though there is a religious fissure between the Shia and Sunni branches of Islam in these groups, there is a socio-political connection between these two groups in terms of their annihilation of Israel, but also in terms of their anti-Semitic discourse. And so their impacts, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups, have been wider, not just mainly on Arab-speaking Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa. I've talked about Pakistan, I've talked about Afghanistan. And central, as I've just suggested, to their rhetoric has been the quote-unquote liberation of Jerusalem. And I say, read that to be the complete dissolution of the state of Israel. And so like many groups, the Muslim Brotherhood has historically suggested simplistic solutions to complex problems with the concept, and this is important, of the victimization of Muslims at the core of its campaigning. You know, I've been doing this work for 20 years now around countering extremism. And I can tell you one of the core elements. There are two core elements. If somebody said, what are the drivers? Well, there are two core elements. Is one, a sense of a lack of identity and a lack of direction and a lack of space within communities for individuals who get involved in radicalization. And the other is a sense of victimization. Okay, so you strip away a lot of the other things, and there are different routes people come towards radicalization and end up in radicalization. There's no one central route. There are many trigger factors, but one of the core trigger factors is a sense of victimization. And you can see what the Muslim Brotherhood and groups like this are trying to do when they punch that button of saying, you, the Muslim world, are under threat. The enemy is Israel and the West. And that is the rhetoric. That is the cornerstone of its rhetoric, which has been promoted within wider Muslim communities who are trying to settle, who are trying to find their space in Europe, for example, and in countries like Australia, who are trying to find their sense of identity. And you can see that if there's a sense of communities trying to edge their way in a new society, in a new community, how some will be drawn to a rhetoric, which actually draws them into a sense of victimization, into a sense of them and us. You can see that. It's precisely what the Muslim Brotherhood has done, and it has done it in a calculated fashion, not a willy-nilly fashion, in a calculated fashion to draw in supporters to its rhetoric. It's as simple as that. And we know that the Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna was an admirer of Hitler and the Nazis. And during the 1930s and 1940s, the Brotherhood became far more political in nature and developed networks in Egypt that targeted Coptic Christians and government officials. And it had also started to implement a policy of targeting minorities. And also, and this is important, in affirming violent jihad, not a jihad of the inner self, which some Muslims interpret as the jihad, as the essence of jihad. Other Muslims interpret jihad to be a violent struggle. In the Muslim Brotherhood context, it was a violent struggle. So their context of jihad to defeat victimization, to defeat being victims, was to use force as a means of asserting its domination. And you can see when that is the rhetoric and when that is the driver, and when it is mixed in with anti-Semitism, you have the real potential concoction for not just a rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes, but the targeting of synagogues, the potential of terrorist attacks, and effectively the loss of Jewish lives. You can see the trajectory there. It is clear, it is unavoidable. In fact, one of the Muslim Brotherhood supporters and members was Sayyid Qutb, who developed a violent political theology from what he had experienced in his travels in the United States. And Qutb, after traveling in the US, saw civilization emanating from the dawn of Islam. His view was effectively the West is corrupted, the West is immoral, it is loose, from his travels, and that Islam is the only way to provide some kind of civilization to the world. And so what he did was to play on a narrative which is pretty much, I would say, promoted within Islamic history. And it's a difficult one because I challenge it, and many Muslims like me also challenge it, who I would say look forward and have a progressive view, is that the view within Islamic history and tradition is that when Islam came into the Arabian Peninsula, that is when civilization began. And the period before it was was a period of what they called jahiliyyah, or barbarousness. And effectively, Islam provided a sense of civilization. So what I've just given you is the core concept of what Qutb took and effectively pulled out and tried to promote through the Muslim Brotherhood's narrative, that actually Islam was a civilizing force and that anything pre-Islamic was barbaric. Okay, that's a cornerstone of the ideology. So if you're a Jew, you sit outside. If you're a Christian, you sit outside. Your values, your views, your human rights are lesser. And that's why when Islamist groups say, well, under an Islamic nation, under a caliphate rather, there would be equal rights for all. It's garbage. It's garbage. I'm telling you that as a Muslim, it's garbage. Because actually Islamist groups do not aspire to that fundamental value. I've just read out why, I've just explained why, which is different to Muslim groups and Muslim communities and the expression of Islamic faith within oneself. So what I'm trying to obviously clarify and consistently clarify is the difference between Muslim communities and those who practice Islam and those who are politicized and have this ideology, which is systemically part of the driver of anti-Semitism and an anti-Semitic discourse we are seeing across the world, actually. And so Qutb's diatribe was focused on Christians and the impact, here we go, of pulling up the Crusades and lumping Jewish communities in with helping Crusaders in the Middle East. Okay, and so you can see harking back to the Crusade periods as a way of rousing passion within Muslim communities, rousing a sense of victimization about something that happened 800 years ago. A sense of rousing victimization. And so Qutb effectively tried to give the view that those who undermine Islam are not just the enemies of Islam, but they de facto included Christians and Jews. So what Qutb was doing, and don't underestimate the power and influence of this man's ideology within groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, was to put a target on the back of Christians and Jews. I repeat, a target on the back of Christians and Jews. So is it any wonder? Is it any wonder that after all of the conflict and the wars that Israel has had with Arab countries and Arab countries have had with Israel, that some who swallowed that narrative started to target local Jewish communities who had been in Arab majority countries for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Can't you see now where the embedded roots of some of this stuff is? And why, the ejection took place quickly. Jewish communities were emptied out of Arab majority countries like Iraq and other places within 2-3 decades, having lived there for thousands. These things don't happen overnight. They happen because the roots are already in place. The roots are already in place. And so we shouldn't underestimate Qutb's thinking and writings in the Arab world and in places like Pakistan. And his virulent anti-Semitism once again fused political Islam, this is important, with a desire to subjugate Jews. Don't get drawn into this view that under a caliphate, all right, that there would be some kind of equality for all. Because the caliphate thinking that we see in today's world, and that is contextually different to the caliphate from early Islam, because we're in a different period, 1300, 1400 years along, in a much more violent and in a much more violent global position, and in a place where we know there are a larger number of individuals who are vulnerable to this kind of ideology. The fact is, we shouldn't underestimate the power of such thinking, where political Islam was fused with a desire to subjugate Jews and effectively intimidate, harass, and threaten them. And central to this has been the liberation of Jerusalem and the annihilation of Israel, as I said. So what did some of this ideology that Qutb came up with, what did it involve? Let's look at it a little bit more in depth. And Qutb started by associating the state of Israel to Jewish power. So he just played on classic tropes. What I was trying to say is basically, and this is important to take a note of, is how groups like Muslim Brotherhood have actually fused anti-Semitism right into the core of ideology. I've talked about some elements, but this is important because this comes back to the manipulation of early Islamic history as a way of creating rage. Please listen to these words, as a way of creating rage, and the rage that they are creating against the state of Israel and against Jews. And I'm not talking about criticizing Israeli government policy, which is a different context altogether. I'm talking about rage against Jews and the state of Israel as a whole, has been that Qutb, for example, took the creation of the state of Israel, linked it to Jewish power, and then linked it to some earliest tribes that attempted to resist Islam and the Prophet himself and Muhammad himself. So what he took was the context of anti-Semitism and give it absolute legitimacy by saying that actually this community was involved in trying to eradicate us. And in fact, they're so evil, they tried to eradicate our Prophet. Can you see how this is really playing to rage? He's not saying, look, I have a problem with this community. He's playing on rage. The first would be anti-Semitic. The second is murderous anti-Semitism. Murderous anti-Semitism. I'm trying to make the case. This is why you're seeing what you are seeing globally. Murderous anti-Semitism, by placing Jews as the earliest enemies of a very fundamental part of the creation of Islam, Muhammad himself. You are then placing effectively a genocidal form of a strain of anti-Semitism into the heart of Islamist thinking. And so this link was made to reinforce marginalized Jewish communities and normalize anti-Semitism into the core of Islamist thinking. And this came secondary to his principal aim of toppling socialist Arab regimes at the time. So his two aims were, one, state of Israel, primary target in terms of ideological bent and in terms of ideological attempt to target. The second was his attempt to effectively overthrow, through the use of his thinking, socialist Arab regimes at the time. Okay, so Islamists have always, in many instances, taken the approach that they want to overthrow the government, and they're not going to use democracy by doing so. Adaptations have taken place over time. We see some of the adaptations today, but historically, It was about using force and military force where they could. So other tropes that Qutb used, subtle narratives that we see time and time again, European anti-Semitic narratives that Jews were the epitome of evil, they were working against God's word. He just changed it and said against God's word in Islam, who also, in his views, spread atheism and who, quote unquote, instigated revolutions. The instigated revolutions was contextually linked at that time clearly to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so what he was trying to say is effectively Israel and quote unquote the Jews are trying to destabilize Arab Muslim majority countries. That's what he was trying to hint at. And in terms of the link going back historically that Qutb said, and this is important because you will find this link in Islamist circles pretty quickly. You will also find it clearly expressly said in groups like Al-Qaeda and in the so-called Islamic State. So what I'm trying to show you is how the evolution of the seeds of this thinking have turned that form of ideological murderous rage into actual murderous rage. So I'll give you one line. Qutb states, one single line inexorably, my God, my language in the morning, connects the battles and the fighting of the Prophet against the Arab idolaters and Jews of the 7th century Arabia, the Crusades of later medieval times, modern Western colonialism, and the current day conflict between Zionism and the Arab Islamic world. Qutb goes on to say, in fact, both sides do not have any choice but to participate in this inevitable and eternal struggle between good and evil. What he's basically saying is that the earliest people who conducted insurrection against Muhammad, the people who were involved in supporting the Crusaders, the people who supported modern Western colonialism, he's taking such a broad brush stroke of history and such a wide approach. And what he's saying is, and those people who are involved in the current conflict between, uses the catch-all word, Zionism and the Arab Islamic world are, we don't have to know, but they are Jews. You can see what it's done. It's just taken a broad sweep and connected them all across. And when you have people in Middle East and North Africa who know nothing about history, who've never been to school, who don't have the opportunity to be educated, who don't have the opportunity to learn more or to be exposed to more information, this gets absorbed in. It gets taken as fact. Why? Because he's speaking Arabic. And he must be speaking the truth because he's speaking Arabic, which is the language of Islam. Oh, so it must be true. And trust me, there are many people who actually think something as simple as that and absorb a lot of the poisonous rhetoric. He's speaking Arabic, so it's got to be true. He looks like he's very learned, or his books seem like they're very learned. It's got to be true. Oh yeah, I disagree with Israel and what they're doing. So you know what? He must be right. And this is the kind of percolation that's taken place. And so within that statement, Qutb also swept up European anti-Semitism and placed it within Islamist discourse. It's also important to say that. He just lifted European anti-Semitism that he came across in the 1960s when he was writing his works and when he was active, and he placed them into Islamist discourse. And so in Qutb's view, the Jewish campaign against Islam was being conducted from two sides. He said, the physical and the spiritual. So here we go. He's basically saying Jews were trying to undermine the very essence of Islamic thought. Not just that they were trying to attack Muhammad and the Prophet Muhammad. Now they were trying to undermine our thought. He said the former, the physical attack was a bodily and material struggle against Islam's society, polity, and civilization. So in other words, there was a physical attack on the structures of Islamic traditions and Islamic communities. Now, here's why I mentioned something around the persecution and around the expulsion of Jews from Arab majority countries. The only word is expulsion. Okay, those that say, well, they left. Well, you're not going to live in a country where you're fearful of your life and you fear being threatened and you fear somebody's going to knock on your door at night. Because here's the thinking that drove some of that action against local Jewish communities that were inherent in Arab Muslim majority countries for thousands of years. Qutb says, one of his beliefs, he says that Jews had infiltrated Muslim societies historically. Let me read that again. Jews had infiltrated Muslim society. Not that they had settled, not that they were people who were to be respected, not even that they were people he disagreed with, which in a modern democratic society, you can agree, you can disagree. Didn't say that. He said infiltrated. And if you infiltrate, you're the enemy. You're not a friend. And if you infiltrate, lots of other things come to mind. Not just you're an enemy, you're a threat, you're a risk. I need to take you out. That is what has been driving Islamist discourse around Israel and anti-Semitism. Not to be friends, not to have a dialogue, not to have some interfaith activities, all bubbly, cuddly, and warm, but to take you out when they can. Take you out culturally, take you out politically, and when there is unabashed aggression, like in the so-called Islamic State, take out minorities in a genocidal fashion. And again, I just want to make clear, the vast majority of Muslims would not aspire to that, but Islamist ideology and Islamist groups have this seed. The level of violence within them can vary. The level of agreement between the use of violence and peaceful means may vary, but the seed of the ideology is there. That's my case. Some may never be violent. Some may never instigate violence, but the seed is there. So what happened in the UK? Let me just go back to the UK context. We know that British Muslim communities started to arrive because of Commonwealth links and in larger numbers in the 1960s and 1970s in the United Kingdom. And many arrived because of work, poverty, familial links, and seeking asylum because of persecution, because of legitimate need for shelter, because they were being persecuted in countries. And, you know, for example, my family that arrived from Uganda were persecuted by Idi Amin. So, you know, I come as a refugee to the UK, and I was given obviously a space and place in the United Kingdom because of the persecution that took place. So there were many people from Muslim communities that came to the UK who had Commonwealth links. We knew English, we knew the system to some degree, and England was the only place we could go. We didn't know French, we didn't know Spanish, we didn't have those colonial links. If we did, we'd probably end up there. So we ended up in England. Okay. And it's important to realize also that we were not politicized around the Israel and Palestine issue when first and second generation Muslims started to grow up. Repeat, we were not politicized around the Israel-Palestine situation and issue. So those generations that came, say from the late 1960s through to the early 70s, or British Muslims like myself, we were never really politicized around the Israel-Palestine issue. The only thing I got involved in around politicization, not even politicization, the only thing that I remember of the time in 1978 was going to watch the raid on Entebbe, because my family left from Entebbe. We were kicked out from Entebbe, which is the airport in Uganda, by Idi Amin. And I remember the film that I watched, which was basically how Israeli Sayeret Matkal commandos effectively went in to save 100 plus Jewish hostages, Israeli hostages that Amin had taken in 1976. So my only connection was to look at this film and feel really energized by what Israel had done, right? To save its citizens and to do it in such a daring fashion. There was no real politicization around Israel and Palestine and around Jewish and Muslim communities. And many of these Muslim communities came from villages that were influenced by Sufi practices. Yes, Sufi practices, such as the veneration of saints. And they came from Sunni mainstream populations. They believed in Sharia, but they were not politicized and believed in a spiritual and familial connection to religion. So not politicized, but a personal connection, a personal sense of belief in faith within a new country as a form of peace, as a form of their inner calm, as a form of their sense of self-identity. Perfectly healthy, natural things that people do when they are dislocated. okay? They look for peace, they look for sense, they look for calm after trauma. Natural thing to do. Today, many of the children, this is important, today, many of the children of these migrants and refugees, however, can be found in demonstrations around Israel and Palestine, with some of them chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, again, I'm not casting any negative aspersion on people becoming politicized. People can be politicized about anything. And I'm sure the Israel-Palestine issue politicizes, as it does, many people. I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about is individuals who believe in this rhetoric, who suddenly have accepted this rhetoric, that actually the dissolution of the state of Israel is something they actively want to see. That is the red line. It is a red line. But many will spout this, many will aspire to this, and many will absorb this. So what has fundamentally happened from them to now? Okay, we've got to look at the chain. What has happened? What has led to the hyperpolarization of many of these individuals? And I claim the following, and there is evidence here that points to this, very clear evidence that points to this in terms of the cases of individuals who have been involved in radicalization. During the 1980s and 1990s, major military and intelligence drives against Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist networks took place in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and other Arab countries, which had strong socialist-leaning leaders. And clearly, socialist-leaning leaders viewed Islamist groups as a threat to their future sustainability, longevity, but also a threat to their state structures. There was no doing a deal between Gaddafi and Islamist groups. Maybe at points, there was no general consensus. There was no melding between Saddam Hussein and Islamist groups. There may have been at points, but there was no melding in general. These socialist Arab regimes actively went after Islamist groups, and Islamist groups actively conducted terrorist campaigns against the state structures. That's how it was. There was no seeing eye to eye. There may have been at times like the Iraq War, when the two came together to effectively target Western forces. But that is for a specific period of time. In general, the two were clear enemies. And so a lot of these Islamist leaders were being targeted by socialist Arab regimes and fled. Many were imprisoned, many killed, many tortured. And obviously, as they fled, many sought asylum in Europe and the UK, and will have sought asylum in Australia. And some of these individuals clearly were involved in these networks, Islamist networks and groups, very driven, had a political agenda. And as you know, anyone who believes that they can see the right path towards whatever they believe God wants, or the right path by which others should lead their lives, these are highly active, highly driven, highly politicized individuals. And in this case, they were also very fluent Arabic speakers. And they passed off their soundings and their nonsense and their activism as literally pure core Islamic text and scriptures, with many Muslims not knowing the difference because of a lack of religious literacy. You know, there is a fallacy that Muslims in the West pretty much are so ultra religious, and these are ultra socially conservative communities, and that they really practice, and they are, 100% into their Islamic faith. The fact is, the vast majority of Muslims in Europe know virtually nothing about Islam. So wake up call. I'm just giving it to you. They know nothing. If you ask them to pray, they don't even know how to pray. And in that vacuum, I place to you, this is what Islamist leaders walked into. looking like there was some kind of Islamic scholar, talking Arabic, which was assumed to be Islamic tradition, and talking violent, sadistic, psychotic craziness. Why do you think some of these individuals end up butchering people on the street? Where did they get that from? Where did they get that psychosis from? Sense of psychosis, of social psychosis. It came from these kind of leaders who themselves were involved in brutality, who themselves used brutality in other countries and who fled those countries to bring their brutalism into communities. And what they found were open Muslim networks that they plugged into, being very energized. They drove local activities. People looked up to them because they sounded like, and it felt like they knew what they were talking about, and what they were talking about was core Islamic text and tradition. It was garbage. And where they were referencing core Islamic tradition, it was totally taken out of its context and twisted to place it within a modern narrative, when all of us know religious text is very difficult to place in some circumstances with today's modern world, and you have to look at it with a lens of what happened 1300 years ago, and take the best inspiration, if you want to, from religious tradition. But these people looked the worst into it. Repeat again, looked the worst into it. And so anti-Israel, anti-Semitic leaflets, cartoons, books, and materials that were sourced, published, and circulated by such as them as self-declared leaders meant that they started to deeply influence local Muslim communities. And some young people within these communities were feeling a clash of cultures. I talked about that before, growing up in the West, yet feeling discriminated and marginalized. And they sought a sense of belonging. And so they were drawn to the rhetoric from these leaders who talked about wresting power and control through a more aggressive and violent interpretation of Islam, something that the parents of these young people would not have been able to associate themselves with through the Islam that they followed. Important. A generational fissure opened up and has opened up. A generational fissure has opened up. And that is why you also find, partly, and let me explain this is why you also find with those involved in extremism, a sense that they start to target their own parents. They will call their parents unbelievers. Yeah, they'll call their own parents unbelievers. They will challenge their parents, sometimes aggressive. They will call their parents people who are beyond the pale of Islam, their own parents. And so what you are seeing is an interpretation of Islam that is so distinctly skewed and different to their parents. Now, what I'm arguing in this talk is that what has happened in the last 30 and 40 years has tilted the skew for some people towards a literally psychotic interpretation of a vastly and mainly peaceful personal form of faith. It has skewed it into this psychotic tradition. And when I say psychotic tradition, it's not an aspersion on those suffering mental health issues. I'm trying to just explain that it is producing this sense of schizophrenia within people, social schizophrenia. They live in the West, they've been to school here, they were born here, but their view of society is them and us, them and us. Attack, defend, victim, attacker. And in that pool, throw in the anti-Semitic rhetoric. Throw it in. Throw it in. And you get things like, let me tell you, you get facts. Let me tell you, I'm not talking aspersion, I'm not talking, conjecture, I'm not talking stuff. In 2003, the attack on Mike's bar in Tel Aviv, I believe. Yeah, Tel Aviv. The attack in Mike's Bar, who was it carried out by? 2 British Muslims, both killed. One carried out suicide bombing, the other one most likely killed by the intelligence services of Israel. What was he trying to do? He came from Derby, north of England, just an hour and a half on the train from me. What was he doing in Israel? What was a young man from Derby doing in Israel? Trying to carry out an atrocity in Mike's Bar. Where's the connection? Well, I just made the connection for you today. There's the connection. And so let me finish off by saying, summarize. Global events of the last 40 years have led to these points. They didn't just happen overnight. They didn't just happen in 7/7 or 9/11. They were significant accelerator points. But the seeds of this movement, the seeds had been sown 60, 70 years ago. And accelerating points then reinforced some of these networks for these groups. And as we had the 9/11s and we had the 7/7s, they then co-opted the narrative of victimization, of discrimination against Muslims, which happens, and which needs to be tackled, as discrimination against any community needs to be tackled. But what they did was to take that and literally blanket it across all Muslim communities and say, you know what, you're never going to be a true British Muslim. They are not going to allow you to be. You see, that's just poison. That's just untrue. Who is they? Second of all, yeah, there's discrimination. Doesn't mean you can't overcome it. Doesn't mean there are systems to overcome it. And third, there are more rights in countries like the United Kingdom and Australia than in many Muslim majority countries around human rights. There are more rights in these countries than Muslim majority countries. So when you look at the facts, it doesn't stack up. But the victimization narrative for them plays not only to their spread of extremism, but to their global spread of anti-Semitism. I'll stop there. Take any questions.
Fiyaz, that was breathtaking. That was amazing. You certainly had me spellbound, and I know that the audience as well. We have a few questions that have come through, and I'm going to just ask one person, if I may, because I think the 2 questions that he posed in the chat are very, very pertinent, but I thereafter would ask that everyone else just put your hand up via the hands up icon, and we'll go from there. But I'm going to ask Dr. Peter Ellis if he would mind kicking this off with the 2 questions that he posed on the chat. So Dr. Ellis, if you don't mind unmuting, or Matan, if you can unmute Dr. Ellis, that'll be great.
Okay, thank you very much. The 2 questions I have are this. The first is, in the 20 years that you've been doing this, have you seen any positive benefit to your hopes and aspirations to limit anti-Semitism, or have you only been observing it? Is my first question. And my second question is, have you or your family, at any personal level, are you fearful at all of reaction to what you're doing? Thank you.
Right, great. So I was just trying to unmute myself. Yeah. So the first 2 things. Have I been involved in just observing or challenging anti-Semitism? Actually, both. All right. So I've been involved in both. The challenging anti-Semitism I have done through things like educational booklets, which look at the stories of Muslims who saved Jews in the Holocaust. Well, those were circulated in schools. It looked at the issue of Albanian Muslims who saved Jews in the Holocaust. Why did I do that? Well, the fact was I wanted to get Muslim communities to start to look at a way by which they would gain an interest in this area of understanding, learning about the Holocaust, with a view to also understanding more about anti-Semitism. Okay, and it was a way to bring them into that, and also to reclaim a part of their history. The issue of Israel-Palestine has been so divisive and used, as I have just highlighted, so divisively, that all the connecting points between Muslims and Jews in Arab majority countries, that history has been lost because of the politics. A lot of it was oral tradition. Some of it was not. But the politicization meant all of that was dumped. All of that was lost. Nobody cared about it anymore. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And so my way has been to use education to try to tackle some of that anti-Semitism by actually using identity as a form of embracing, celebrating a form of Muslim identity of these individuals who saved Jews in the Holocaust, and then entering into the world of understanding what anti-Semitism is about. And I say this, just another last few things. I always tell members of British Muslim communities I meet, why shouldn't we be involved to be specialists around the Holocaust? Why shouldn't we? We should be. As Muslims, we have a stake in understanding this mass genocide. Why shouldn't we be involved in being specialists? And that's one of the things I'd like to see, that British Muslims academics in the future become real specialists in this area, protect the information, preserve this information, and actively take a part in ensuring our heritage. And let me be clear, Jewish heritage is my heritage, right? Where do we think Islam, parts of Islam, originated from? They didn't just come, look, some Muslims will say, God gave us that view, okay? I'm going to give you a different alternative. I'm going to give you my alternative, my thinking, which I think is a bit more realistic. It was taken from Jewish tradition. It may be difficult for some of my co-religionists to hear, but the fact is Jewish heritage and Jewish tradition is part of me. It is part of me. And it is my duty to explore parts of my history and my heritage, and where I can, to learn about it, preserve it, but also to empathize with other communities. So, I take it very strongly. Last bit on your question, second part of your question was, do I fear? Look, the answer to that is, I've had some terribly difficult times over the last decade. Okay, I've had some terribly difficult times. There are people being jailed for targeting me. Yep, spent time in jail. I've had lots and lots of abuse, a lot of emotional trauma from threats made to my family, people looking up my address. There was a period of 7-8 years where I was traumatized. I'll be honest about it. And I look back on it now, and I was traumatized because all I was doing was firefighting daily to try to keep my family safe, to keep loved ones safe, to keep myself safe. And there was a point for a year I was looking over my shoulder like some kind of paranoia had set in. So this is not an easy world we live in. And I'm not saying that, there's anything special about me. All I'm saying is, if we don't push back, then we're in very serious trouble here. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you so much, Fiyaz. We're now going to move on to the next question, which comes from Suzanne Rutland. Suzanne?
Thank you. Lots of different questions, but one I'd specifically like to ask you is, I'm a professor of Jewish studies at Sydney Uni, and I was working with a Muslim student in terms of religious education, helping her. We had an issue with an ABC program where a Palestinian commentator accused Israel of genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And this religious student and myself got into correspondence afterwards on those issues. And she consistently quoted the Quran to me. She presented these terms, and in the end, a list of 9 from my view, problematic terms relating to Israel. And these, of course, are also terms used by the left. And I didn't really know how to explain to her, number one, as a Jewish person whose members were murdered in the Holocaust, why it's so problematic to talk about Israel carrying out genocide, and why, so how does one respond, in other words, to these type of accusations coming from Palestinian Muslims, but some very religious Muslims who would claim that they're not anti-Semitic? Yet you say wanting the destruction of Israel, and I agree with you, is anti-Semitic. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's a good question. So we know that extremist ideologues will manipulate sacred text. We know that. It's happened through millennia, right? At various points, extremists from any part of different religions will manipulate sacred text. It's no different within Islam. It's no different within groups like the IS and Al Qaeda. They'll manipulate it to suit their own desires and needs. And yes, and I'm not going to wash over the fact that there are some very difficult texts in all of our traditions. There are some very difficult texts. What I am saying is, and what I tried to hint at, is that there is a vacuum of leadership within Islamic theological circles globally. Okay, we have to be honest. There is a vacuum of leadership. Part of it, some used to say to me, Islam's strength is that it doesn't have a central leadership. I used to kind of agree with that when I was younger, because I thought, well, that gives Islam more pluralism, and it gives Islam a wider variety of different traditions by which people look at their faith. But I now disagree with that. And I think that if there is no central organization, no central premise of Islamic theological gravitas within any religious tradition, you're going to have what is called kind of super fragmentation. And what we are seeing is Islamic tradition and text that is becoming so mutated in different parts of the world, that it is becoming exceptionally different to the Islam I know. It is becoming dangerous. It is becoming so bizarre. And that's the problem. There is no sense of strong Islamic directional theological discourse. And I think that is one of the failures that has taken place within the theological world, in this theological Islamic world. And it's pretty clear, and I'll explain why. Because actually, over the last 60, 70 years, Arab socialist regimes have actively not wanted a strong theological discourse because it was seen as a threat. So they broke it up. And when they broke it up, who did it hand that theological power to? The extremists. These states never created strong theologians or gave the theologians the opportunity to have that strong debate. They suppressed it. When you suppress it, you move them towards the extreme groups. And so, that vacuum is a real problem. And until that vacuum changes, and it's going to be a long time, and God knows whether it will even adapt and change to have a central leadership of sorts, we are going to be in this problem. But I think it's important for Muslim theologians, just to finish up, to actively contextualize, to actively rebut any hatred that is being espoused using religious text. It's a difficult thing to do on the back of what I just said, being targeted for hatred and intolerance. But listen, if people really, I say to fellow Muslims, if you really care about Islam, you better step up to the plate. Because if you don't, the Islam we know today is going to look distinctly different to the Islam we know in 100 years from now. And some of the trajectories I don't like seeing.
Yep. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next question. Alex Katz.
Yes, hello. I wanted to ask you how you got into this work in the first place, and what it means to you to be able to do this. Are you still a practicing Muslim? And that just about your own background and what it means for you doing this kind of work.
Yeah. So how did I get into this work? So I was an elected councillor in 2002 in a place in Oxford, in central England. So I got elected to be to be a local municipal representative, and I remember it was in central Oxford itself, a very affluent area. And I say that because what happened kind of in a way affected my future work life and professional life. So the Gaza conflict happened in 2002, 2003. And there was a lot of anti-Semitic discourse that started to take place within Oxford. And I thought to myself, this is a very liberal city. Why are some members of the local Jewish community, who are my local residents, coming to see me saying that they're very fearful? And I realized that this very small Jewish community was feeling very fearful. And it hurt me. I felt pain from it. Instead of solidarity, I felt that some other minority communities were targeting the Jewish community and promoting anti-Semitism. And so for me, I realized that, we needed people to try to bridge communities, reduce some of the volume of hatred, and try to build some dialogue points between the two. And that's the direction I took after the issues in 2002, 2003. I set up Faith Matters, the organization. I set up Muslims Against Antisemitism. And I've been working ever since. But that was the trigger point. The trigger point was, why is this small Jewish community feeling so embattled in the middle of this extremely ultra-liberal city in Oxford, in central England? And sadly, some of my co-religionists were involved in the anti-Semitism that was taking place. So it inspired me to do something. Am I practicing? The answer is no. My form of Islam, I would say, is about my identity. It's about my culture. It's about, who I am. Part of it is who I am. I have a range of identities. I also say this to Muslims. You're not just one bit. You have a range of identities in all of us. But I believe passionately, just because I don't practice does not mean, and I don't drink alcohol, I don't eat pork. So, I kind of adhere to core values here of Islamic tradition. The Islam I knew and grew up with was really a peaceful inward form of Islam that was all about spirit and spirituality and other people, right? The Islamic interpretations I see today, which talk about autocracy, which talk about domination, are so poisonous to Islam itself, that I feel Muslims like myself need to step up. And it's not just poisonous to Islam, it's poisonous to our fellow human beings, right? We have to step up in this battle of ideas. We have to, otherwise we are going to have a clash. And whilst I don't believe a clash is anyway imminent, and I don't believe it is going to happen, the fact is we can't allow the dominoes to fall where people are constantly pushing divides. We can't allow it. So I guess what I'm saying is, I value other people as much as I value other Muslims. That's what I'm saying. We're all, frankly, deserve better.
Amazing. And last but not least, the last question is going to be from Helen Pawsey.
Yes. My question is, has the worldwide concentration on COVID had any impact on anti-Semitism? And has it given rise to an increase or an opportunity to discuss it in different forums such as this? And depending on the questions, what can we do to keep it as an issue worldwide when the focus is on other things, particularly COVID at the moment? It seems to me that when everybody's concentrating on something else, it just gives rise for opportunity for other things that we've tried to suppress to come back again. So what can we do to ensure that this stays as an issue and it is dealt with?
Well, it's really, thank you for that. I think actually the issue of anti-Semitism has spiked during COVID and has actually remained a topic of discussion during the COVID period. Sadly, whilst we need to focus on tackling anti-Semitism and to focus on it, the reality is COVID also supercharged anti-Semitism, not just anti-Semitism. I'll be honest with you, it also supercharged racism, anti-Muslim activity, and anti-Roma activity, right? It brought out the worst in some communities and it brought out the best in others. So it kind of polarized where some people were. And so, we know from the work of organizations like the Community Security Trust here in the United Kingdom, which monitors anti-Semitic hate crimes, that there have been a number of issues during COVID that have led to more anti-Semitic discourse online. So people blaming, quote unquote, the Jews or the Muslims or the blacks for promotion of for spreading COVID have been graphics and memes that have been spread online. We know that. So we've seen some of that activity, and it spiked at certain points. And then clearly the Gaza-Israel issue came in and kicked in, and then people threw in a lot of this kind of COVID thinking behind it to say, see, these communities, actually blaming both communities then, see, both of these communities are a problem for us in Western society. So either way, Jewish communities have been labeled and stereotyped during COVID for spreading viruses, and so have Muslims. And in a way, we have both been blamed for, in a way, importing the problem of the Middle East, even though we have not done that. So we've not been able to win either way as both communities. However, let me just come back and finish off by saying this. You know, there will be other global issues, sadly, and let's just be truthful. Whenever those global issues happen, Jews will be targeted, sadly, whether it's because of graphics being spread around or people saying that Jews are involved. And so the virus of anti-Semitism has not gone away. I argue that it has got much more strengthened in certain areas. And we have some real problems on the horizon that we need to overcome. And the use of social media and young people absorbing what they are reading, not just in the extremism side that I've talked about, but also in absorbing hatred towards other communities, is something that leaves a legacy and an imprint. Do not think for 1 minute that those young people who consume material against the whole of the state of Israel, not policy of a government, but against the whole of the state of Israel and against Jews, do not think that doesn't leave an emotional or mental imprint. It does. How we address that, how we gently change that, how we challenge that is what we need to keep doing and thinking as we move forward.
Fantastic. Clearly this discussion could have carried on for another few hours at least, but unfortunately we have to bring this to an end, and I'd like to call on Adam Geyer, my dear friend and fellow March of the Living journeyman and supporter, to sum up and pose a vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay. Have I succeeded in unmuting?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's attended tonight for taking time out to listen to the important talk. And of course, we want to thank our distinguished speaker, Fiyaz, for not only addressing what is a very significant topic, but also doing it with great courage and with great honesty, with great humility. And so I go away a little bit, no question, I feel a little bit dispirited listening to that, because first of all, I'm told reliably that anti-Semitism is on the rise worldwide. And we know that anti-Semitism is real. We know that it is hateful. We know it is evil. We know it must be confronted. But it is an enormously complex issue. The root causes for it are multiple, so the solution has to be multiple. And since anti-Semitism is ancient, I think we should also understand that the fight will be long, and that we should be prepared for a long fight against it. We must forbear, and we must be persistent. Also, I want to acknowledge Fiyaz I see you as a very courageous person to speak publicly about it as a Muslim. I'm very distressed to hear about the trauma that you've suffered personally as a result of your stance, which is a very principled and honorable stance. And I'm reminded of Maya Angelou's quote on courage. She says, "Courage is the greatest of all the virtues, because without it, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently." And so I commend you for your courage, and I commend you for the principled stand that you've taken for many years. And we should all join you in that cause there are very many small things we can do and some big things we can do to counteract this evil in society. And I have optimism that the good will triumph. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Just a departing thank you from me to all of you for attending, and a reminder and invitation to attend our next session, which will be on Sunday the 29th at 7:30 p.m. for a talk on lockdown versus locked away, a survivor's perspective, and a reminder to follow our latest campaign calling the sport-loving community of the world to join forces in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate in sport by following our socials and hashtag Never Means Never and Athletes Against Anti-Semitism. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fiyaz. Thank you, Adam. Have a great evening.